Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is U.S. Army Major General retired John Davis, who is now Vice President of the Public Sector for Palo Alto Networks, where he is responsible for expanding cybersecurity initiatives and global policy for the international public sector and assisting governments around the world to prevent successful cyber breaches. John Davis, welcome back to the Cognitive Crucible.
Well, thank you, John. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to talk with you again, and I'm looking forward to catching up from our last chat that was almost 3 years ago.
That is exactly right. And so the conversation that I want to have with you today, John, will first talk about I think what you call your 4 operational rules that you've been socializing with global leaders for many years now. And additionally, like you just said, I'd like to revisit some of the same questions that we covered during your previous Cognitive Crucible appearance, which was January of 2021. So almost 3 years ago. All right. So, but before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your most current assessment or hot take on our strategic landscape, or some people prefer to think about it about the times in which we live?
Sure. Well, I could say a lot of things, but honestly, the best word that comes to my mind, at least, is unsettling. I don't want to discount all the tremendous positives that are out there, opportunities that are available based on many different factors, technology probably representing some of the most impactful in terms of providing opportunities to benefit us as a society as well as individuals. But what gets my attention are the dangers that we're currently facing. Threats to democracy, Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Hamas war, not just assault on democratic nations, but also this is causing divisions within our country, both of these examples. It includes the economic instability at home and internationally, the unprecedented societal anger, and what I would call raw cultural and political divisions that permeate social media at home and throughout many Western democracies, and the dizzying pace that technology is charging at us. And are we really ready for the consequences of this seemingly unstoppable speed and scale of very recent developments like generative AI? The opposite of the negative side of the positive tech opportunities I mentioned before. But finally, the most alarming for me personally is the state of adversarial information warfare that's being waged by Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and their surrogates against the U.S. and its allies and partners around the world to accelerate a lot of what I just mentioned and to gain an advantage over us without ever having to cross the traditional threshold that would trigger an armed response. This global instability seems to me to be ever increasing, and I'm not sure I see an end to it or even a lessening of it anytime soon. So I use the term unsettling to describe our current strategic landscape, and that's why I believe that discussions like ours today that explore ways to counter these trends, especially that last one, are so important.
Great. Yeah, that's a great perspective and a scene setter. So like I said at the top, I wanted to ask if you could present to our audience, I think what you call your 4 operational rules, and maybe give a quick backgrounder as to how you came to formulate these rules, but just super quick for our audience, just so people can maybe track along. The way I've captured these rules is there's four of them: transparency, SOPs for oversight, sharing of threat intelligence, and banning third-party actors. But like I said, do you think you could rewind just a little bit and provide a little background, and then briefly go over these rules?
Sure thing, John. First of all, this is not original thought from John Davis.
Okay.
This is the articulation of things that this country and many of our partners and allies have been trying to do for many years. It's just codifying them in a way that we can reach out to expand these as rules of the road, and even talk to our adversaries about these. And this has been about the need for internationally accepted, what I call operational rules of the road, and the primary purpose of them is preventing miscalculation and unintended escalation in this world of information warfare and cyber competition and conflict. And I've been focusing the last 8 years on advocating for several of these rules of the road in cyberspace. I was focusing on this in my last role in the military in the Pentagon as the senior military cyber advisors for almost 4 years before I retired as well. These are different from the more traditional, UN group of government expert norms that you may have heard about over the past decade plus. The UNGGE, as it's known by, has been trying to codify international agreement about the types of cyber activities that should be required by responsible nations, like protecting online human rights and the right to privacy, as well as cyber activities that should be prohibited, like conducting or knowingly supporting activity contrary to international law that intentionally damages critical infrastructure. And in that effort, that's a very long-term effort, there have been some successes in gaining agreement among the many nations involved, including China and Russia, but it's been very difficult. It's been uneven. At times it's faltered. And so I take a little bit of a different approach, and I'm trying to do two things with what I call these operational rules of the road. The first thing is to recognize that states are going to conduct cyber activities in pursuit of their state interest, and focus on the rules in which states should abide to increase transparency, stability, careful oversight, and control by accountable entities, and more effective participation from the private sector in defense. At the same time, the rules are designed to reduce uncertainty, reduce or eliminate the use of irresponsible parties, and minimize the chances of making a mistake leading to escalation within the cyber realm and spilling over into the kinetic realm. I mean, if we're going to go to war, not that I'm advocating for it by any means, it should be a carefully considered, deliberate decision and not as a result of a mistake. The second thing is that we have to recognize that we have to be realistic and focus on the practices that, like I said before, the US and many of its allies are already doing, or at least trying to do, in order to encourage other nations like China, as both a strategic competitor and in some ways even a partner, to do the same in its own best interest and help us set a more responsible and stable example for the rest of the world. So given all that, here are the 4 operational rules that I've been advocating for in forums in Australia, Singapore, at NATO conferences, in the US, and including numerous times in China, in Beijing. Rule number 1, during peacetime, responsible nations should be more transparent about what they're doing in cyberspace and why they're doing these things. This would apply to law enforcement, homeland or domestic security, and especially with the militaries of responsible nations. And there's no expectation of total transparency. However, there should be greater transparency than exists today, because it can lead to better, certainly not strong within certain countries like China, but better trust, which can lead to greater cooperation and teamwork on issues of common interest. Some may say this is an unrealistic norm, but I think there are good practical reasons for pursuing this kind of approach. When I was in the Pentagon, 2012 to 2015, the US military distributed white papers about the establishment of the cyber mission forces under US Cyber Command and each of the service cyber component commands. And we briefed not only US government and military partners around the world, but countries like Russia and China as well about the general force composition, its purpose, its missions, and how it would be accountable and controlled by responsible oversight. In 2016, the US military publicly declared it was conducting cyber operations against ISIS. And while not disclosing any classified information, the efforts demonstrate the US military's increased transparency with not only other partners, friends, and allies around the world, but also with competitors and potential adversaries. One of the dynamics, I think, making increased transparency possible and even likely is the increasingly lower bar for getting cyber-related activities declassified, especially when it comes to cyber threats, but also when it comes to what we're doing in general, unclassified terms to counter these threats. And I think this is good on many practical levels. There are open public discussions today that simply could not have occurred only a few years ago because the US and many of its allies lead by example and no longer classify cyber activities the way that they used to. And over the past decade, public examples of greater transparency and threat attribution, things like the North Korean attack against Sony, and our actions, our reaction to that as a result of it. The Iranian distributed denial of service against the US financial sector, China's PLA attacks against US industry and the resulting indictments, the Russian 2016 election interference and the resulting sanctions, indictments, and other response actions. And I think this trend continues with some of the activities that our country's been doing to counter election interference. And it's good to increase clarity, accuracy, and transparency by bringing these activities out of the dark world of espionage and criminal activities and into the light of law enforcement, domestic security, and especially professional uniform military operations, just like other government functions are treated. And I think if you do that, you can lower the level of uncertainty, you can reduce the chance of mistakes, you can increase stability, and even contribute to deterrence because public and diplomatic exposure of malign activity has become a powerful tool in some cases. So that was rule number one. Any questions before I go on to two?
As you were talking, John, I was just curious, what do productive conversations look like or sound like with, some of your counterparts that you've been in discussions with in China or Russia or even North Korea, for example? What do those conversations look like and sound like, and what are some of the follow-on benefits?
Yeah, well, there have been no conversations with North Korea or Iran.
Okay, gotcha.
There have been, to my knowledge, very little communications with Russia after Crimea, and that occurred when I was still in the Pentagon. We did have productive discussions with them prior to that. But China is a different matter. And, I've been at this with China for 11 years now, and I've noticed a difference. I've noticed a change. It's been slow. It's been difficult. It's been very uneven, and it's been hampered by the overall difficulties between the two nations, economic, South China Sea and military activity, North Korea and China's involvement with, those things have overshadowed attempts to try to talk about things like being more prudent in cyberspace. But at a more of an unofficial level, it has occurred. And I think the idea, at least from my perspective, has been to start small, find areas of common interest where there's something in it for both countries and internationally as well, and then build on that. And so that's in general, that's been the approach. And I found my Chinese counterparts, used to be my military counterparts, now retired, are willing to talk. They didn't used to be, and they are. So I think that represents maybe some small progress.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Excellent perspective. All right. Well, could you please proceed with these operational rules?
Sure. Rule number two, again, not original thought. During peacetime and increased tensions and even during armed conflict for that matter, responsible nations should establish and enforce standardized procedures for effective oversight of military, law enforcement, and homeland security cyber operations. And this includes risk management assessment and control procedures that result in the following effective outcomes across four categories. Category one, domestic and foreign policy oversight from the competent authority as established by the nation. Category two, technical oversight. And this would include a technical gain versus loss assessment, which addresses the unintended consequences resulting from discovery of a technical capability and its potential use against other targets. And it includes a technical assurance assessment, which would provide a, like a low, medium, high assurance level rating that the capability will produce the technical outcomes or effects as intended and not produce unintended consequences. The third category is operational oversight. This would be with appropriate responsibilities, accountability, and command and control procedures that verify positive control within an authorized chain of command. And then the last category would be legal review, which would provide an assessment for both the capability and the operation in which it is employed as it applies to either the international law of armed conflict or other applicable domestic and international laws and agreements. So that's rule number two. Questions about that?
Well, yeah. So you've been out of uniform for several years now and working at Palo Alto Networks. Does a rule like that apply at all in commercial or corporate settings?
Well, I mean, my experience is in cybersecurity. So in the defensive protective aspect of, protecting our clients worldwide against the cyber threat in general. And it comes in obviously many, many different forms. This rule number two is really more about the employment of offensive capabilities than it is about defense. And this leads me to rule number three, where I do believe that industry plays a significant role.
Okay, great.
Rule number three, during peacetime and increased tension, responsible nations should share cyber threat intelligence for criminal and terrorist threats of common interest. Responsible nations should establish and enforce effective information sharing programs and platforms. They need to be automated and format standardized, or else you cannot keep up with the speed and scale of the information sharing that's required to be effective. You can't pass hard copy information and intel like we used to. Cyber threat intelligence and information sharing programs, they have to be focused on the right stuff. Cyber threat indicators of compromise along the cyber threat life cycle steps or kill chain or whatever you want to call it, as well as contextual information. It shouldn't include, objectionable information like personally identifiable information or protected health information, intellectual property content, or other types of information that would create a surveillance, privacy, liability, policy, or legal issue. The information sharing should be done government to government in appropriate channels, diplomatic, law enforcement, domestic, intelligence, military. But responsible nations should encourage sharing programs and platforms between government and industry, between industry and government, and within and across industry as appropriate to, the national and international laws and agreements. So industry and the international community play a critical role in making this rule more successful. And, so why have this rule? There's a lot of very complex activities going on out there all the time. It's difficult to see the signal through the noise. And the result of effective information sharing is to help reduce that noise to signal ratio so that responsible nations can better focus on what's important and not be confused or distracted by the ever increasing amount of cyber criminal and terrorist activity that might cloud, this already confusing cyber landscape. And in doing so, if you don't do that, it can contribute to misinterpretation, miscalculation, mistakes, and inadvertent escalation. So that's why I think that one is so important. Of course, the challenge is common interest, finding those common threats to focus on. That's a lot easier to do nationally than in some cases internationally.
Right. Yeah, I see how you keep coming back to like maybe like an overarching theme with these four operational rules of the road being to hopefully mitigate and prevent the likelihood of unintended escalation. I'm curious also if you and your colleagues have ever thought about this notion, and I mean this would be kind of like a chronic problem that runs through this entire problem space, is that with mis and disinformation and cyber attacks and the need for cybersecurity, uh, one of the emergent problems to me seems to be like a slowing down of the pace of operations, or getting to the point where it's hard to get things done because we have to be so mindful of security and double checking, triple checking, verifying that this information that we're consuming is in fact accurate. Have you and your colleagues ever discussed this kind of like a pervasive problem that is facing the entire globe, actually?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a couple of years ago, and it's, these rules are focused mainly on cyber-related activities.
Hmm.
Um, but the problem is greater than cyber. Cyber is one of the most potent tools in our adversaries' information warfare kit bags, but there are many other tools. And you name some of them to clutter the information space with misinformation, with disinformation, with divisive material, causing divisions and um, causing Western democracies to basically tear themselves apart.
Mm.
And and that I think it's a problem that's much broader than the rules that I'm proposing here, because I'm focused on cyber.
Right.
And and yet the all of these other capabilities, these other tools, they are just as pervasive as the cyber related threats that are trying to steal your information, ransom, hold for ransom your information, uh, uh, use it to threaten organizations, use it to degrade, deny, disrupt systems and networks. Um, so it's a much broader problem, and I think we're going to talk about some of this as we
Sure.
wrap up
Yeah.
the operational rules.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So you've covered transparency, the need for SOPs for oversight, the need to share threat intelligence, and could you cover the fourth rule, please?
Yeah, the fourth one is the most difficult in my opinion, especially when talking to some of our adversaries. During peacetime and increased tensions, and especially during armed conflict for that matter, responsible nations should ban loosely controlled third-party actors and organizations from engaging in offensive cyber activities. And these third parties would include surrogates, front companies, technical research in quotes
Mm.
organizations, criminal entities, moonlighters, even patriotic hackers.
Mm.
And these type of actors and organizations, they increase uncertainty, they reduce stability, they lack the oversight and control as discussed in, rule number 2, and they're driven by an assortment of high-risk motivations and increase the chance of a miscalculation and attribution as described in Rule 3 about intelligence sharing, that could easily result in, unacceptably high risks of escalation, especially during times of high tension.
Mm.
Unfortunately, the world is seeing an increasing use of these loosely controlled third-party entities by countries like Russia and China and Iran and even North Korea. It's an alarming trend to me because the risk of a mistake happening or an unsanctioned action by someone with a personal motivation that results in a significant consequence, I think that risk is growing exponentially, and there should be a common interest from all responsible nations to prevent that from happening. So, a lot of people have asked me if I really believe that these rules are realistic, and I can tell you, the U.S. government, the U.S. military, an increasing number of U.S.-based cybersecurity private sector companies not only think so, but are increasingly and actively pursuing each one of those four rules. So, yeah, the U.S. can and is leading by example in these rules, and the U.S. has been willing to engage other great nations to broaden the effort and make it an international standard and even improve on it. If you think about it, pursuing these rules is really not that much different from other international efforts among both friends and adversaries alike. Things like nuclear nonproliferation, anti-piracy, counterterrorism, the elimination of child pornography. These are international issues of common interest, and therefore there is cooperation among many nations that you could count as adversaries. So yeah, I think these are realistic and need to be pursued.
Right. I mean, this definitely was not the main mention within your point about banning third-party actors. But what are patriotic hackers? How would you describe that kind of a group of people?
Well, it's a pretty broad category, and I think it fits a wide spectrum of capabilities, intentions, et cetera. But if you look at, for example, you look at Russia's use of patriotic hackers, I think in some cases, when what the patriotic hackers are doing serve a national interest of Russia, Russia sometimes looks the other way. Sometimes they inspire these activities. And other times, I think they try to covertly direct and support these activities. But so it's a wide variety, and it gives them cover. And I think other countries do the same thing to give them more cover. But the problem is this can lead to mistakes. And I think it's a very dangerous tool that many of our adversaries are using.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Well, that is a lot for everybody to think about and consume and mull over. And it's perfect that this is coming out right at the close of 2023. And it's like the end of the year is a time for reflection. So I think that these are great topics for everybody in our audience to reflect upon, and maybe we'll be revisiting a couple of these things as we go through the rest of our outline here. So as I said back up at the top, John, I'd like to maybe revisit some of the items that we discussed 3 years ago now. And so one of the things I asked you about was what kind of advice do you have for young information professionals, the new generation or the next generation of men and women who are coming into this field? And as I recall, one of your key points, and I guess I'd like to ask, do you still agree with this? And what else would you add to this? But one of your key points was that in information operations within the military in particular, is that your integrity matters, and your ability to build and maintain relationships within your staff and maybe some of the external organizations that your unit is engaged with is of utmost importance. So I guess I want to ask you, do you still agree with that? And also, what other things would you want to pass along to that young captain or E5 that is just getting started in their career relative to PSYOP and information operations?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I went back and looked at that discussion 3 years ago, and I think I started by saying, you, the information professionals of today, you're now on the front lines in modern warfare.
Yep.
And it's still really important to believe what I'm saying about the front lines in modern warfare. I'm being very serious about that. I went back and looked and said that, I thought back then that Western nations were experiencing a time of great risk to national and international security, economic viability, public safety, and societal stability. And our adversaries know this, and they're positioning themselves to gain an advantage with a lot of urgency and using many tools associated with information warfare throughout an extremely fertile digital environment of social media and other even traditional media. And I said I didn't know if it yet represented an existential problem, but I said it was certainly a situation where our adversaries recognize as offering significant opportunities for repositioning of advantage and relative power among nations. Now, I believe it is quite possible that this problem is indeed existential in terms of the impact that it can have on our existing form of a democratic republic if we let things continue. I said before that, influencing Western domestic publics to cause, these extreme divisions, cultural, political, other divisions, and cause us to demonize each other instead of recognizing who's behind it, or at least in some cases, boosting these things through the use of information warfare techniques. It's a powerful tool, and it's something that I believe it's gotten worse. I think it's gotten worse and more effective against us and our partners and allies, and it's harder to detect the distortions over the past 3 years. So that's why I mean what I say about being on the front lines of modern warfare. I still believe our national security, our economic competitiveness, and even our public health and safety is on the line. Now, what you said about trust, building relationships is really about trust and credibility. And I put a lot of stock into building relationships. And I still believe that this will be absolutely critical to our young information professionals' success. I think that I used the example of my experiences in the special ops community over my career spanning the 80s and the failure of the Iranian hostage rescue mission and the lack of trust and credibility for that community back then, and what it did over the years to build that quiet professional credibility and become what the nation needed, especially after 9/11. And I suspect that, while I admit I haven't followed recent developments as closely as I used to, I suspect the same trust and credibility required to make the special operations community the capability that we needed is what the information warfare community must strive to achieve today. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope things have changed. I suspect that information warfare professionals, however, are still looked at with varying degrees of suspicion and dismissal and ignorance about what you can and cannot do. And I believe no service, in my view, has yet invested the priority and resources that are needed to elevate the information warfare community to what the nation needs to fight on, what I call the front lines of modern warfare. And I have to admit that might be changing. I know, for example, the Army just recently rewrote doctrine on this, on information in modern warfare, and calling it this time information advantage. And I haven't had a chance to read through the new doctrine, but so far, what I read from it looks promising to me. And I want to read some quotes from Mark Pomerlau, who wrote an article on this in Defense Scoop. I know Mark, I've worked with him, I respect him as a journalist. And he said that the US military as a whole has begun a shift, recognizing the importance information plays not only in conflict, but in everyday life. Adversaries have sought to exploit the information realm on a daily basis within the so-called gray zone below the threshold of armed conflict as a means of undermining US and allied interests without having to confront them in a direct military conflict. I couldn't have written that any better myself. I really believe that's the case. Here's the quote from Lieutenant General Milford Beagle, commander of the Combined Arms Center. And he wrote that this new doctrine represents an evolution in how Army forces think about military uses of data and information, emphasizing that everything Army forces do, to include information and images it creates, generates effects that contribute to or hinder achieving objectives. And as such, creating and exploiting information advantages is the business of all commanders, leaders, and soldiers. I can identify with that. I mean, that's how I started. I started as an infantry guy, and in my first joint assignment that was thrown into having to learn about information warfare and getting all the clearances and learning the specifics of the various specialties and figuring out how to integrate and synchronize them into the overall, construct of the operation across the joint force, across the interagency, with international participation and even participation of industry. That takes a significant amount of investment, and that can't be handed off as something separate to a group that are supposed to be just the information professionals. It's got to be a part of the whole. And so what this says to me, nested within the Army's new operating concept of multi-domain operations, envisions the continuous synchronization of capabilities across all 5 domains of battle: land, air, sea, space, and cyberspace. Describes a combined arms approach to creating and exploiting information objectives. That, I couldn't have said that better. That's my view of where this needs to go. And there are 5 information-related activities mentioned: enable, protect, inform, influence, and attack. So we'll see. That those, in my view, are the right concepts, the right words. Remains to be seen if we mainstream this, as the Army appears to be trying to do, or we continue to marginalize it, which has been the case in the past. And so I think that, I just say the jury's out until we see the resources, structure, processes, et cetera, that put some meat into making these words reality. But regardless of whether things have changed or are changing for the better these days, I believe information professionals have to earn that trust every day to be considered credible information professionals. And the really big decisions, in my experience, the really big decisions in life, life and death decisions, they may be informed by the head and the heart. They may be informed by intellect, the head. They may be shaped by emotion, the heart. But the really big decisions, those like life and death that you and I are familiar with, picking your mate and closest friends, risking your fortune, serious family decisions, they're based on the gut. And this comes from intuition. It comes from inspiration. It comes from imagination, and it comes from instinct. And personally, I believe it's instinct that's shaped not only by the sum of one's life experiences, but I believe by thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years of a genetic fabric that's molded humanity over time. Not to get too philosophical, but it's that inner voice that tells you what's right, even if it's not what you would rather do. And so that's about. And I would submit that the first priority our information professionals should focus on, besides really knowing your trade craft better than anyone else, is learning how to build trusted relationships. What you will be required to do requires effective teamwork across many different functional communities of the profession of arms, as well as different functional communities and cultures across the interagency and international and industrial landscape. It requires the approval of many levels of leadership that may not understand the magnitude of what you're doing as well as they should. You have to be coordinators, not owners of capabilities. You got to master the integration of these various information-related capabilities, and there are many of them required to achieve a position of advantage against our adversaries. And you have to be seen as a trusted and credible professional who can be counted on to deliver real outcomes. I said back, 3 years ago, nothing's more important to your success, and that has not changed in my view.
All right. Well, thank you for that refresh on all of that. Two quick things. One, we had a great discussion a few weeks ago, and we'll put a link in the show notes with Colonel John Agnello, who currently leads the Army's Information Advantage program office. So we'll put a link to the show notes, and he did a deeper dive into a lot of those information advantage topics that you were just mentioning, John. And number two, as far as the genetic fabric of humanity, I agree with you about our decision making and instinct, but I think one of the challenges that's plaguing us these days is that the technology that we have developed and are enjoying in so far as it improves our lives, but that technology is like outstripping or outpacing our evolutionary our ability to adapt evolutionarily. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it's I think that's just like you're really contributing to some of the problems that we're seeing today. Would you generally agree with what I'm trying to say there?
Yeah, I think I know what you're trying to say, and there's tension there. Obviously, there's tension, but I'm a little bit more hopeful. I'm a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
hopeful that technology will be used to augment and enhance that genetic fabric. Who knows what the future is going to bring? Technology is coming at us so quickly. We have to be careful about the unintended consequences. But I think if you focus on how you can use that to continue, a positive evolutionary change or the evolution itself, then I think that would be what to, that
Mm-hmm.
would drive the pursuit of the future.
So another topic from our previous discussion, John, basically, I wanted to know from you, what are the kinds of things that America is doing right today?
Yeah, John, I remember last time, I think what I said was America's not doing enough right today. But, again, while I'm pretty well versed across what's happening in, the industry cybersecurity landscape, I have to admit, I haven't been following all aspects of our national level efforts in this arena. Things like our efforts across the interagency, state, global engagement center, covert efforts, and even military or military supported efforts. So I can only tell you what the picture looks like, sort of from the outside. And I think there continues to be a growing recognition of the importance of whatever you want to call it. I call it information warfare. But I think we still have lots of challenges. Um, I think we definitely know how to do this. We've done it well in the past. Last time I mentioned one wartime scenario where we were really good at it, World War II. One non-wartime scenario, the Cold War, um, at least not a traditional war. And I think we tend to do better when these type of efforts, especially on the offensive side, stay in the shadows. I think that's still the case. And I sense it's increasingly hard to do that today for a number of reasons. I think I said last time, the larger the military involvement needed and the broader that the effort was required, the more resistance we encounter from a roles, responsibilities, equities perspective among the different segments of our, deliberately divided form of government. And that's why I said Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea don't have those kinds of problems. There's not all that infighting. It's a lot easier to do these things when you're in an authoritarian type of government. But I think that, it's just difficult to do. And I think part of the problem is there's a resistance to getting our hands dirty before that traditional threshold has been crossed.
Mm.
And in order to do that, in order to be willing to get your hands dirty before that threshold is crossed, you got to be willing to admit there's a threat significant enough to warrant that. I believe that's what we're facing today. And I'm not talking about only the use of military information warfare capabilities, though the military ought to have the broadest and most capable across the various functions. I don't care about who gets credit for what and who's got the authority to do what. It takes a national and even an international effort to be able to do it, first has to come the recognition of the threat and that it's serious enough to warrant that. That's what happened in the Cold War. The threat of nuclear annihilation drove us to do things that maybe caused us to get our hands dirty. But this takes, my experience as a combat infantry officer learning information warfare, not just the Army combined arms concept, but integration and synchronization of joint interagency, international, industry. This was, an investment of 3 years of learning for me as an infantry officer, not an IO officer yet. So this is something everybody should understand, but it requires significant investment. And all the various things that, those things I learned from 1995 to 1998 as an infantry officer, I was dangerous enough then to bring those skills to JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, and apply those in support of nationally significant missions. And it was because of the recognition that those missions were so important that I think we were able to do a lot of these things. I don't know that we have that recognition today, and I think that's what it takes.
Right. Also, previously, we talked about the definition of cognitive security, which is, what the Information Professionals Association is all about. And this is one of those kinds of questions where if you ask 10 different scholars or experts, you probably get 10 different responses. But previously, when I asked you about how you define cognitive security, you discussed things like what you called term warfare and squabbles over pots of money with these kinds of definitional questions. But anyway, so is term warfare still going on in your opinion? And are these kinds of monetary squabbles still happening? And do you have any fresh thoughts on what you think about when you hear cognitive security?
Yeah, I think I said before that the best way I could think of describing cognitive security for my younger relatives who don't know much about it would be saying, don't be fooled. This applies to you as a person as well as an organization. I still think that's about right in my view. And I still think we argue over terms, command and control warfare, then information warfare, then information operations, and now information advantage. I mean, going back to Mark Pomerlau's article, he said the Army has sought to avoid the term information warfare, preferring to use the phrase information advantage. The service has been charting down a path of information warfare since the 2018-2019 time period, but bureaucratic bottlenecks and competing desires led the Army to adopt information advantage as part of its doctrinal lexicon. So that tells me that, that the term warfare still is a thing, and it shouldn't be. My advice to anybody who will listen remains to forget about that dynamic. And I still really believe it's information warfare, by the way, maybe not in the traditional war sense, but in the same form as political warfare or economic warfare. But just call it what it is. It's modern, it's information and modern warfare. And from what I've seen in the Army's new doctrine, that's the message that it appears to support. So, once again, we'll see if action, resources, structure, and processes follow the message. The combination, or the common objective across every single function or capability involved in this modern form of warfare is to create and maintain a position of advantage over our adversaries in pursuit of national interests. And again, the new Army doctrine on information warfare or modern warfare says exactly that. So, and that's what every one of our adversaries are doing to us right now. And it's, again, this is, from what I've read, it's acknowledged in the Army doctrine. So I think, and by the way, I think we're still losing. So
all right.
In terms of, I'd say, this is what I'd say about not being fooled. I'd say, it's not just the adversaries that are a cognitive security problem. I mean, industry is trying to sell you things. They're the ones listening on your iPhone and your your devices, because they're trying to gather information to cause a behavior in you to buy things. It's not necessarily the U.S. government that's doing it unless there's a warrant on you. So it's, to me, the best way to approach this is to be discerning about anything you see or hear these days. And it's about handling, with a bit of common sense and some basic research before you act. Who is really behind what you're seeing or hearing? And what are they trying to influence you to do? So, do some research, get validation from various sources, have a suspicious attitude. These things, to me, represent the application of cognitive security for anybody or any organization. And so,
Yeah.
and by the way, these various entities are trying to fool you with increasing speed and scale because they're using automation, they're using software-based advanced analytics, including AI. And I think that the dangers of generative AI will make it more and more difficult to tell fact from fiction, to tell what's authentic from what's being distorted to cause a specific behavior, whether it's political, cultural, or to make money. So my assessment about cognitive behavior is essentially the same as it was when we last discussed it. That it's only the situation's more urgent, in my opinion. So don't be fooled. Be suspicious. It's not about being paranoid. It's just being smart in today's world.
Right. That definitely sounds like a necessary skill for everybody to continually hone and refine, and it's necessary for the 21st century. Well, this has been fantastic, John. Perhaps we can do a quick lightning round and then close it out. So
Okay.
lightning round, 30 to 60 seconds or so per response. Your opinion, your hot take on TikTok.
Don't. Look,
Excellent. All right.
the cat's out of the bag and there's no putting it back. However, I just don't think most people, especially younger people, understand that this is a platform that's used to both collect information about you as well as to feed you the information required to shape your thinking and your acting. And that means, as we discussed before, it comes to, when it comes to our adversaries, they're looking to incite behavior that undermines the societal fabric and institutions that underpin democracies so they can gain an advantage over their opponents.
Right. The second lightning round, your biggest worry, and I think you mentioned something like this at the top, but do you have any new thoughts on your biggest worry?
Well, today, biggest worry is the potential negative aspects of generative AI that can be used against the U.S. and Western democracies, as we discussed. The speed, scale, precision targeting, it's hard to distinguish real from fake or distortion. Tomorrow, it's quantum computing. There's a lot of positives for sure in every aspect of our lives, economy, critical infrastructure, military capabilities. But the negative is that encryption is going to be gone. And it's going to happen in increments, we believe, between 5 and 15 years as the number of logical qubit grows. You need about 4,000 plus to crack the most powerful algorithms today. But it's going to happen. And the threat it's actually already here. It's called harvest now, decrypt later. So, they're hoovering everything up because at some point they know they're going to be able to crack the encryption. So my recommendation for that would be secrets that require long-term storage, government secrets, patient data. That stuff needs to be moved to the strongest possible encryption now, or it's at risk of being exposed.
Okay, wow. Last lightning round. What is the coolest new tech that you are aware of that you can discuss, obviously?
Well, I mentioned the bad side of generative AI, but we're finding there's a very, very powerful positive side when it comes to cybersecurity. And we're just at the beginning of this, and there's a lot more to be revealed in the coming weeks and months. It won't take years, but the idea is to leverage it for improving the human-machine interface, to make it faster, easier, and more, and this is the tough part, more accurate for cybersecurity teams to interact with their technical capabilities and outmaneuver cyber threats, who will also be using AI for the negative aspects.
All right. Closing out, John, we have a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a fruitful research question that is related to the kinds of things that we've been discussing?
Sure. There has been a lot of recent reporting. I think there was a New York Times article about this just this week about China's onslaught of disinformation oriented towards Taiwan in the run-up to their January elections. And the reporting indicates that there may be some important lessons about how Taiwan has handled this onslaught, including public education efforts with support from international media literacy partnerships, as well as more active countermeasures by mature communities of fact checkers, government investments, and law enforcement investigations. I think it would be a great research project to examine the techniques and capabilities employed by Taiwan and analyze the effectiveness or lack thereof to assist the U.S. in preparation for the 2024 presidential elections, as well as our overall national effort to counter the information warfare efforts aimed at the country by Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea and their surrogates.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And to our audience, if any students out there have examined something similar to what John was just describing, please let me know. It would be dynamite to have you on to discuss your learnings on around that kind of a topic. And then finally, John, could you recommend a good book that is either related to the kinds of things we've been talking about, or perhaps this is something that is just on your bedside table right now?
Sure. I have two quick recommendations. The first one I've already talked about. I recommend that our information professionals read the brand new Army Doctrinal Publication 313. Like I said, I haven't read it thoroughly yet, but from what I've read so far, I think it's promising and believe it's at least, it's potentially a step forward in a more effective application of information in modern warfare. The second, I would recommend for those specifically interested in the cybersecurity aspects of information warfare. My old friend Rick Howard wrote a book, Cybersecurity First Principles, a reboot of strategy and tactics. Rick is, besides being an old friend, he's a former Army cyber commander before Army Cyber Command was a thing, former chief security officer at Palo Alto Networks, and he's currently the chief security officer and chief analyst, senior fellow, and podcast host for the Cyberwire, now under N2K. And this book is fascinating. Rick is a good storyteller. It explores the history of InfoSec from the 60s to current day, why it's failed, and what the InfoSec community should be trying to achieve instead, and the arguments for the absolute and atomic cybersecurity first principle, and then strategies and tactics that help you adopt that first principle. So those would be my two recommendations.
Wow, that's outstanding. Well, so we will have links to these resources that John just mentioned in the show notes. And with that, John Davis, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thank you again for having me. I really enjoyed it. And to all those information professionals out there, I wish you the very best of success.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.